Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today, Learning Across Disciplines with Art and Science. And welcome to everyone. Thanks so much for introducing yourselves in the chat. It's great to see you all here. My name is Philippa Rappaport. I'm the lead for education and engagement at the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology. That's a central education office here at the Smithsonian, and we are the office behind the Smithsonian Learning Lab. I'm joined today by Carol Wilson. She's the London Chair of the London Education Chair at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Also, Alison Cawood. She's the Associate Director for Public Engagement at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And Carol O'Donnell, who is the Douglas M. Lapp and Ann B. Kaiser Director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center. Also, Jennifer Collins, who's the Learning Experience Manager at the National Museum of Natural History. And also, behind the scenes, we have Rhett Ransom, who's providing IT support from the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology, and also Joy Horton, who's providing our captions today. So thank you, everyone, for being here. In our session today, our presenters will talk about ways to bring art and science together for STEAM education. They'll share techniques to combine art and science into engaging activities for K-12 classrooms. They'll discuss underlying strategies to integrate history, art, culture, data literacy, and science focused on real-world phenomena and problems. So they'll share 3 examples from their work at the Smithsonian, and you'll leave today with a collection of replicable activities and resources to make learning come alive for your students. This is a pan-institutional partnership to support STEAM education, meaning putting that A in STEM, and we'll talk more about that today. So a few logistics before we dive in. If you need captions, please just push the Show Captions button, probably at the bottom of your screen. We welcome your comments and your questions. You can use the chat function at any time. We'll also field the Q&A if you leave your questions there. And we really want this to be as interactive as possible to make this the best session for all of us. You're already introducing yourselves. That's great. So this is a picture here of the Smithsonian Learning Lab. Cultivating Learning is a program that we do to support educators using digitized museum content. And you can find anything that's been digitized across the Smithsonian on the Learning Lab. And so if you scroll to the bottom of any page in the lab, you can click on Get Started, and that takes you to our help page. And that's where you can find more information about how to use the lab. If you were to click at the top there where it says webinars and events, that's where you would find our archived sessions. So today's session will go on that page in as soon as I get it up there, usually within about 2 or 3 days. The last session before we take a break for the school year is next Monday, June 16th, and it's called Unleashing the Power of Music Across Subject Areas. And that's to introduce a suite of resources being created by Smithsonian Folkways, which is part of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. And I'll put a link to register for that program in the chat in a little bit. So a reminder that this session is being recorded, and we always like to start out with a question. So today's question to get us started that we'd love to hear your thoughts on is, why make the shift from STEM to STEAM? Why put that arts there? And I'll turn it over to Carol Wilson now.
Great. Thank you, Philippa. Thanks for that great intro and all of those good housekeeping reminders, and for introducing this great question, why make the shift from STEM to STEAM? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the chat. If you have any thoughts, pop those in there. And as we're thinking about that, I just want to take a minute to think about art and science together. Sometimes we look at art and science as opposites, things that may exist on the opposite end of the spectrum. We may think of making art as creativity and imagination and no wrong answers. And in contrast, we may think of science and engineering and math as more about facts and evidence and provable, measures. But what if the two disciplines actually meet somewhere in the middle? So love these answers that are coming in here. Science has always been included in art. Yeah, thinking of the naturalists back to the 1800s. Someone's writing, it encourages a creative approach to problem solving. Absolutely. Art can be used to support all content areas, from depictions of nature and science, materials. Art is part of culture. Yeah, exactly. So is science. Giving the students a chance to demonstrate their learning and bridge gaps in abilities, help students to think outside the box. Absolutely. Creativity, analyzing data. Many students are very artistic, and I'd like to offer them more opportunities for them to show what they know is a new way. Ooh, I love that observation. Thank you, Lindsay. So I was thinking the same things as I was grappling with this question, the same things that you are, that the practice of science and art share many things. First of all, curiosity, to have a desire to learn, to expand knowledge, to push boundaries, to embrace complexity. And curiosity leads to asking questions and seeking answers. A scientist and an artist both may start with a question when beginning their work. And they keep asking a lot of questions and interrogate things from many different perspectives. Why is the sky blue? When was the universe formed? How does one atom bond with another? How can I make a visual representation of an idea? So artists in science are also both problem solvers, which some folks hit on that in the chat as well. How can I find a cure? How can I make this building or sculpture or ceramic bowl stand up without collapsing on its own weight? What do I have to know in order to do that? How can I convey ideas and emotion by manipulating material? And artists and scientists also observe. That's how we learn, through observation. So taking in data through our senses and interpreting that data as we make meaning of it for ourselves so that we can understand. And in the end, I think both science and art do help us understand, whether it's understanding our natural world, how our bodies work, our shared histories, or how we interact with each other as humans. I think there's this natural synergy between looking at at the world through a scientific lens and an artistic lens. So when you put science and art together, powerful things can happen. Someone also mentioning in the chat about the two practices going hand in hand and should be embraced equally. I love that. Instead of science in service to art or art in service to science, approaching them both as equals. Sound waves of the science of music. Oh, I love that. We actually have an art object at the museum that is a sculpture that makes music from tracking the motion of the clouds. So there's definitely that wonderful interplay there. I love that. Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. All right, great questions and great answers. So why don't we move on to the next slide, Philippa, if you would do the honors for us. Just to frame this conversation a little bit, when we're talking about why STEAM education at Smithsonian, really just wanted to show you quickly how we are focusing on that at Smithsonian in our strategic plan, in our shared focus areas. You can see maybe Philippa, you could activate those two little circles around science and education. There we go. We're so fancy. In these 5 focus areas, looking both at science in addition to our education goals here, sort of harnessing science expertise to elevate science in the global discourse is our science goal. And our education goal to build and enrich a national culture of learning by engaging with educational systems nationwide. So thinking about how the Smithsonian as this wonderful interdisciplinary place where we have art and we have science, we have history and culture, and how we can look across those disciplines to really tell compelling stories that build on all of the objects we have, the expertise we have with people here in the Smithsonian, and how you really can teach these topics across many disciplines, no matter what you're teaching in the classroom. So with that, I guess we will jump into some of the content here. If you will move forward one slide for me, Philippa. Thank you. So I am joining you today from the Smithsonian American Art Museum and our Renwick Gallery. We are one Smithsonian unit that has two gorgeous, beautiful historic buildings that you can see here on the slide. These wonderful buildings in Washington, D.C. contain brilliant works of art and craft that for us really document the visual culture of our country, from objects made over 300 years ago to literally last week. They really put together, tell this rich story of who we are as Americans. Through art, we seek to understand our histories, connect with our present moment, and imagine our collective future together. There's over 40,000 objects in our wonderful collection, and you can really pull the thread in so many different ways. So today I'm going to pull a science thread and warm us up for our discussion today on looking across disciplines with art and science. So we're going to take a minute to sort of, again, look at something that is a good exemplar of artists who meld those two disciplines. And when we think again about science and art, as we've just talked about, what if students interested in science or STEM fields could tap into their artistic creativity? And how might the creatives in your classroom recognize and nurture their science identity, which we know is a driver of whether they may see themselves as a science person or whether they may enter a STEM field? So for inspiration today, I'm going to share with you the work of two visual artists who sort of bridge that gap between science and art, whose practice as artists take their cues from the world of science. And these are creative makers who have mined scientific data and found a way to make it visible through their art. So why don't we jump in? First, we're going to do some close looking. If you can go to the next slide, Philippa. All right, wonderful. So take a minute. I'm just going to put a question in the chat for you. Take a minute to look at this sculpture by an artist named Janet Eckelman. Here you're seeing a very large art installation in the grand salon of our Renwick gallery, and we're going to practice our observation skills here for a minute. You're seeing two different views of it on the left side and the right side, and I want you to just take a minute to look at it. And as you're looking, here's a question for you. What descriptive words come to mind when you see this sculpture? You may not even read it as a sculpture. You may think of sculpture as something on a pedestal that's made out of marble or made out of, bronze or metal. So thinking about this as a sculpture or sculptural installation, feel free to jot down a few words on a piece of paper, or you can share your thoughts in the chat so others can connect with them if you'd like. Ooh, fantastic words: organic, flowy, suspended, enveloping, metamorphosis. People noticing color, energy, bright, exciting. Flowy again. I didn't think I'd say the word flowy twice in one day. Thank you very much. Texture, fishing, someone is saying. Fishing, that's really insightful because these actually are made in a process similar to fishing nets. People noticing color, red, orange, undulating. Oh, the Northern Lights. Yeah, that's fabulous. So many great words there coming into the chat. So why don't we go to the next slide, Philippa, and we'll see another view of it. Now you see it's sort of from above. This is almost a bird's eye view of it. If you're perched on the ceiling, sort of looking down at it, you're perched in the corner there. So observe a little bit more. What more do you see from this perspective? So now someone said water. They're thinking maybe, the color is changing. A nest, perhaps, when you're seeing it from that height. You're seeing the sort of volumes and the sort of shapes that may hold something from above. And it looks a little different from the previous slide. There's colors people are noticing: the magenta, the yellow, the cyan, levels of the ocean maybe. Ooh, y'all are so good over here getting these good observations. More translucent, calming, billowing, iridescent. The lighting really, contributes to that. Thank you so much. All right, let's go to another slide and see another view of it. Okay, now you're seeing it from the perspective of the ground. Instead of from above, you're seeing it from sort of below. So what new observations do you have? Now we're seeing people also in the space. How are people positioning themselves in relation to this artwork? What do you notice about with them and what they're doing? And again, so sort of thinking about what we see on the wall. This seems to have a light component to it. So not only the sculptural piece hanging, but you can see these sort of projections off the side. Stillness, people lying in the ground and staring up. Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a dynamic sculpture, and as it's swaying, these swaths of colored light cast shadows, almost like projections on the wall. So we do encourage people to lie down on the carpet if they like to and experience the movement and color that way. And what does it look like if you were to lie down underneath it? Philippa's going to change the slide and show us the lying on the carpet view, so to speak, just as if you were there. So if you were lying under this piece and looking up, this is what you would see. So what is this luminous object that we've now looked at from many different angles? I love the wow in the chat. Ooh, someone said reminds me of weather patterns. Fantastic. You guys are very insightful here. This luminous object is a large hanging sculpture by Janet Eckelman, and it's called 1.8 Renwick. So the Renwick portion of the title is because it's in the Renwick Gallery. And it's this vibrant light and fiber installation that examines the artist's fascination with the measurement of time and the energy of the earth and all the powerful natural forces. And it was inspired by a scientific data set, which you'll see in the next slide. If you can go one more for us, Philippa. So this sculpture was inspired by the data recorded on March 11th, 2011, following the huge Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that rippled across the Pacific Ocean toward Japan. And this map is from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, their Center for Tsunami Research, and it shows the energy sort of released across the ocean during the tsunami. And it charts the maximum wave heights in centimeters across the duration of this storm. So this geological event was so powerful that it actually shifted the Earth on its axis and shortened the day by 1.8 millionths of a second, which is why the artwork is entitled 1.8. So imagine a storm that is so powerful could actually change time. The artist was fascinated by this idea and this concept and wanted to create an artwork that captures the experience of this event. So translating a two-dimensional data set to a three-dimensional artwork. So think of the choices that the artist had to make when creating a work of art based on this data set. If you can go to the next slide, you can see a little bit more of the scale and what it's made of. So imagine you were going to make artwork out of that data set. Think about scale. If you made something really small, say tabletop size, the experience of it would be much different from lying underneath it. When it's suspended overhead and you're seeing it from below, we as viewers are sort of engulfed in the size and the undulating shape and the power of the piece. And this really illuminates some of the complex interconnections between the human beings and our physical world. If you can go to the next slide for me, Philippa, you can see a close-up of the material. Another thing artists consider is material. What types of media to make this out of? She could have made it out of almost anything, but she used these very fine fiber threads that are knitted together, almost like a fishing net, as someone noticed very astutely. It's also translucent, so you can see through it, and it's at once delicate, but very, very strong, sort of alluding again to the strength of that storm. And it really is the artist's sort of meditation on the forces we can understand and control, and those we can't, like in nature, and helping us sort of put those concerns of our daily existence when we're watching the clock and thinking about time and sort of putting that in context with larger cycles of time. So here you're seeing a way in which an artist is literally taking a data set that was embedded onto a map, and she's creating a 3D experience from that. And it adds, we're sort of physically moving as we move under and around this sculpture. We are kind of overcome with emotion. We're using our 5 senses to see all the different ways that it moves, how the light interacts with it. So adding an artistic layer to a scientific data set, you can see the way in which it sort of humanizes in some way or adds so much emotion to what that data could be telling us. Because all data tells a story just as an artwork tells a story. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you just another quick artwork that also tells a story. This piece is called Foreclosure Quilt, and it's a quilt made using data from a set of foreclosures. So in Washington, D.C., the artist Catherine Clark in 2015 took a set of data in which houses were foreclosed upon in Washington, D.C. And she created this quilt, which is essentially a map of DC. If you're familiar with DC, you might recognize some of those, streets and angular parks in the middle. At first, you might look at this and think it's kind of an abstract design. But once you look more closely, if you can go to the next slide, Philippa, we'll see a little bit of the detail. You can see that each of those little red marks that she's put on there represents a foreclosed house. So I love the interplay of data and media, choice of media here. When you think about a quilt, you may think of something that is warm, something comforting, something reminds you of home, something that may be passed down generation to generation, something that you can, snuggle into and be comforted by, something made in community. But when you think about foreclosures, you're thinking about people who are losing their home, perhaps losing a community. And so I think it's a brilliant way the artist took a particular data set and really seek to humanize the story behind it by using it to create a quilt, which gives us a completely different sort of emotional message and pushes a bunch of different emotional buttons. The other thing that she does is all of those little red marks, instead of being an added layer of red fabric, she cuts a hole out so you can see the red underneath. So it really is like loss. She's removing something from the quilt, from all of those little marks. And every little red rectangle on this quilt tells a story. So when you think about, again, ways that data can tell stories, a way artwork can tell stories, and what the intersection of those two can be, and how they, again, can add together to really create understanding. I think this is just a brilliant illustration of how data and science and art can come together in that way. So thank you for your deep looking and for sharing your thoughts. We will share more about these artworks in the Learning Lab that Philippa will share at the end. So don't worry, you'll have links to those. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alison, to lead us in another direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So like Carol said, I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction. I'm going to share an activity that we've developed and started using with educators and students here at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. So I'm located over on Chesapeake Bay, and so we use a lot of data from Chesapeake Bay and this region and work with students and teachers on kind of place-based learning and data from their environment. So we're going to show you one of the ways that we're doing that. So next slide, Philippa. So first off, the activity that I'm going to share today is about water quality and visualizing water quality data. So just to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about that word and make sure we're all in the same place with that. So if you want to go to the next slide. So when I'm talking about water quality, I'm talking about generally, oh, sorry, go back one, Philippa, please. Can you go back one more, please? Yeah, thank you. So it's essentially like how safe this water is for the people and living things that are supposed to be there, right? So this includes things about the physical properties of the water, the chemical properties of the water, and the biological features of the water. So all of those different pieces come together to talk about water quality. And so it's not just necessarily if sometimes people will think water like looks dirty, and that doesn't necessarily mean the water has poor quality. There can be lots of reasons that water is different colors, but this is like how safe the water is for the living things that are trying to use it. All right, next slide, please. You can click it one more time and get the, oh, sorry, go back. There should be a diagram that comes up on that water quality factors slide. Yeah, there we go. So we can think about lots of different things with water quality. So like I said, this can be biological things, so like bacteria in the water. So that's a thing that comes up for folks. This can also be things like plastic or other kinds of like man-made pollution that are in the water. It can also be from natural things. So things like excess nutrient runoff that's in the water, or a lot of sediment that's gotten into the water. So just soil and dirt that's gotten in there. And then the dissolved oxygen and the pH are kind of things that are impacted by these other pieces. But there's just lots of different ways that you can think about water quality and what that means. Next slide, please. In Chesapeake Bay, kind of starting back, oh, go back one, please. starting back in the about the 1970s, there were a lot of efforts to really improve water quality in Chesapeake Bay. And so there's a program that does a water quality report card every year. This is the first year since they started doing this, that water quality in Chesapeake Bay has had a passing grade. So it's still not great, but it's the best it's been in a long time. So that's, movement in a positive direction. But this pulls in a lot of those different things that I was talking about. So this looks at like sedimentation and nutrients in the water and that kind of thing. So it's in this part of the world, it's a thing that comes up and that we talk about a lot. You can go to the next slide, please, Philippa. So what we've done is try to create an activity where you can look at this data quality through the lens of art. So kind of like Carol was saying, and like all of you had in your awesome comments, there are a lot of reasons to do that, right? Like there are students who are just not going to respond well to graphs, who might respond if you presented that exact same information in a different way, or students who don't think that they're good at science, but think that they're good at art. And so if you can give them a way to engage around science topics in a way that they're comfortable with, they might be more willing to do that. So we've been really thinking about ways that we can do that and kind of support students who have these different kinds of identities around some of these issues that impact all of them if they live in this part of the world. Next slide, please. So what we did was create a pour painting activity. Oh, go back one, please, Philippa. Is a pour painting activity. So pour painting it was very trendy on YouTube a few years ago, but it's a really easy way to create art. Essentially, you put layers of paint into a cup and you pour that over a canvas and you tilt the canvas so that it covers the whole thing and let that dry. And it creates these really interesting and beautiful pictures that don't require you to have a lot of skill at drawing or painting, and you can still create something that's really beautiful. So what we did was take data from Chesapeake Bay, going back to the 1950s, which is when they started collecting data in a systematic way across the bay, up until the 2010s, and took data and turned it into these pour paintings. So we went from some of the data that's on the right or on the left, and where I'm looking at this, and we turned it into a painting. So you can do the next slide, please. And the way the activity works is there's actually several sets of these data. So they go by decade, so it gives you a decadal average. And so it goes decade by decade. And so each factor related to water quality. So we have in this some biological factors. So like the amount of oysters that are in the bay. We have some and then some chemical factors. So things like nitrogen and phosphorus, and then a physical factor is turbidity, is how much like sediments in the water. And so we did a decadal average. So that's looking at the average amount of these things in the bay. And so you can just see by the changes in the color where some of these things have shifted through time. You can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we looked at a variety of things. So we did oysters, which are a really big keystone species and like very closely tied to water quality in the bay. We did seagrass, which is, again, it's a natural ecosystem. It's really important for a lot of the fisheries development, and it doesn't do well in poor water quality. We did fish, and this is an important fisheries fish. So we used rockfish, which are in the Chesapeake Bay, and then phytoplankton or algae, which respond to the changes in nutrients. And so in general, when you're thinking about water quality, more oysters, more seagrass, more fish are good things. More phytoplankton is often not a good thing. Then we have some physical ones. So we have dissolved oxygen, which is just the amount of water, oxygen that's in the water. And we have nitrogen, phosphorus, and turbidity. In general, more dissolved oxygen is good. More of the nutrients and turbidity is less good. So those are the things that we're looking at the changes for. You can go to the next slide, please. And then we broke these down. And when I say we, I should actually clarify exactly who this we is. I had an amazing group of high school interns who worked with us a few summers ago, who actually pulled all of this together and did all the work with the data. They were amazing. They did such a fantastic job. So they found all the data, and then they did a decadal average. They did an average for that parameter, because you can look and see these are in really different units, right? Oyster is measured in bushels, which is how much you're actually taking out. turbidity is in milligrams per liter, phytoplankton is in micrograms per liter, seagrass is in acres. So those aren't directly comparable kinds of things. So what they did was average for each one, and then have the decadal average divided by the parameter average, and then they scaled them for the amount of paint so that we'd always have enough paint to cover the thing. So it's the proportion kind of within each metric. You can go to the next slide, please. And then what the students actually do is they create these pour paintings. So they layer their paints. So we've been giving individual students or groups of students a decade to work with. They put their layers in a cup. We use just oral syringes, like what you use to give medicine to really young children. Works really well for these, actually. So everything is pretty easy to find, and we tried to make this something that's kind of relatively inexpensive and easy to do. So they use the oral syringes to do the amount. They put that all into the cups, and then they each pour that onto the canvas. And then we've been able to create some other content around that. Can you go to the next slide, please, Philippa? So we have this, when we have the lesson for this, it's broken down into a couple of different pieces, and they're modular. So kind of depending on who's going to use them and what your context for teaching is, you might want different things. So one of them is more on like a high school and middle school level, and it has a lot of information about what is water quality. It has a lot of really traditional visualizations of the data, so mostly graphs and tables of the same data that's in the pour painting. And we also have some information there about policy, particularly some of the policies that changed that impacted water quality in Chesapeake Bay. So things like the Clean Water Act and some of the different Chesapeake Bay agreements are part of that. The other has some information about data art and what data art is and different ways you can use that in your classroom. And then it has the pour painting activity itself. So kind of depending on how this makes sense in where you teach, you can mix and match. Go to the next slide, please, Philippa. And then it's kind of broken down with manuals and worksheets and all the different pieces. This is all in the format. I don't know if any of you have ever used a story map, which is a really great way to share like information that has lots of different pieces. So the story map is about water quality, and it includes, maps and data and text and images and all these different pieces that are together. So that's in there, and then all these other pieces. You can go to the next slide, please. And then one of the activities is about graphing. And so it's really thinking about not only the data itself and how you do that, but how to best show some of these data and having students think through, because when we give students data, when we work with them, they almost always want to make a bar graph, like pretty universally across the board. If that's what students want to do, is make bar graphs, which is great for some things. It's not always the best for others. So we have them, part of the activity is thinking about what kinds of graphs are the best fit for different kinds of data and how you might make graphs differently for different audiences and depending on what you want to share. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then like I said, we also have it connecting to policy. So we have information about the some of the major environmental policies that have happened that impacted Chesapeake Bay, and have the students looking for some of the patterns and where they can see some of those different parameters that change with that. And it works really well with the pour painting. Actually, you can see like when you did Clean Water Act and the nitrogen dropped off, you see it in the painting. So it's really great. So it's been a really fun activity and integrating across some of these things. And that is available in the Learning Lab collection that Philippa has put together and is going to share. And yeah, Julie, I see you asked about the story maps. So yes, those are ArcGIS. They're a really fantastic tool. We use them a lot for all kinds of things. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol O'Donnell for her to talk about some of the ways she and her team are using STEAM.
Yeah, thanks so much. Let me get myself acclimated on my side. So hi, everyone. My name is Carol O'Donnell, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center. And we are so fortunate because we work in a place where we are surrounded by research centers like where Alison is at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, at the National Museum of Natural History, where Jen Collins is, and beautiful art museums like the Renwick Gallery and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where Carol Wilson is located. Our organization, the Smithsonian Science Education Center, was founded 40 years ago for the sole purpose of working specifically in classrooms across the country and the world. So we work directly with schools, school districts, state education agencies to create and curate resources for and programs and services for teachers that helps to basically transform K-12 education through science, history, art, culture, but predominantly science, in collaboration with communities across the globe. Next slide. So I just want to ask, if you could, in the chat, how would you use art to teach the topics that I'm about to show you? All right, so with a click. All right, so we've got biodiversity, climate action, clean energy, clean water, good health and well-being, innovation and global citizenry, responsible consumption, sustainable communities. These are these global goals that exist that could be integrated into social studies classrooms, science classrooms, art classrooms. So if you've ever used art to teach some of these sustainability topics, can you just mention that in the chat? Just say, yes, I've done that, or in what way? So have you ever used art to teach sustainability topics? So Julie has done that. This is not easy. Like, these topics are not that, sometimes we find them in lots of different classrooms, but whether or not we've also integrated them into art classrooms. So Lisa Anderson said, yes, she's used them through concept drawings, and Jessica through poster making. And Jessica, it's funny because we do find that when we're asking students to think about actions in their community as it relates to protecting biodiversity or making their community more sustainable, they love this idea of sharing their ideas through poster making. So yes, the recycling and planting, and imagine what, like, some of our students actually created their own potted plants. Catherine Blanchard is on the line, and she works with youth ambassadors all across the globe, and they send in their videos, and they've created like potted plants made out of paper. So yes, lots of different ways for students to use art and integrate it into sustainability topics. So on the next slide, part of what the Smithsonian Science Education Center has done is try to understand, do we find these sustainability topics in classrooms? And if so, how are teachers teaching them? So on the one side, we have a very traditional way of teaching these topics. For example, just teaching students, what is biodiversity? Can you define it? Or what is the water cycle? Can you define it? And so if you click one time, you'll see that's the traditional way of addressing these topics. And this is what most of our standards look like. So for example, in our science standards, we'll see water is spread throughout the planet in various forms. Through the water cycle, water changes forms and is redistributed. Humans affect water resources. And that's a very traditional way of thinking about how to teach about the water cycle or teach about water. But on the right side is a much more complex way that actually allows students to integrate history, art, culture, and science into the teaching of the topic of water. So if you click one more time, you'll see this is a more sustainability focused way of addressing water. Students are knowledgeable about water, and they use sustainable water practices in their local communities. Students communicate how the disruption to the water cycle, such as through pollutants, affect access to clean water. And that idea, and we saw kind of an example from one of the chat entries, is that how would students communicate how things like pollution might affect their access to clean water? They might use art. So here we say, using trash found to create a sculpture to encourage cleaning up of their environment, including their local waterways. Or drawing a poster that communicates what students have learned about how their communities can use more sustainable water practices. All right, so in the chat, if you haven't yet and you want to contribute, one more click. How might you use art to assess students' knowledge about water or about conserving clean water in their community? So go ahead and add your thoughts to the chat. How might you use art to assess students' knowledge about water or about how they might conserve clean water? Well, this is interesting from Jenna. Jenna, you're talking about how teaching artists about the environment risks with their materials, like how certain oils used in printmaking or paints can affect air quality. I don't know if you can come off mute, but Jenna, that's a great contribution, that kind of bringing in this idea that if I'm an artist and I'm using certain tools or materials, what risk might those tools or materials, like certain oils, how might they impact our local waterway? So that's a great example of bringing knowledge about art and knowledge about water together. And oh yes, this idea, third graders creating torn paper and stop motion videos showing the water cycle. That's a great example. All right, so the next slide. So these examples, like what to do with the water cycle or how to teach in these sustainability topics in a much more integrated way by bringing history, art, culture, and science together in one place, are found in a series of guides which we call Smithsonian Science for Global Goals. And so this particular example that I'm going to share with you on the next few slides, in which art and science are brought together, come from the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals Climate Action Guide. And it demonstrates how art and science can be used together to help students understand the impacts of global rising temperatures. Now, of course, there's much more to this guide than just that one particular activity, but I'm going to share with you just that one example of how art and science come together to help students understand the rising global temperatures. Next slide. So this particular guide, Climate Action, which you can get from this particular QR code that I have up here, it's called Climate Action: How Can We Mitigate Human Impacts on the Atmosphere? And every one of our guides takes students through a cycle called Discover, Understand, Act. Discover, Understand, Act. And that's how the lessons are structured, and that's also how the guide is structured. So under Discover, students are encouraged to study climate systems and their effects on their own local community. So in the Discover portion of the lesson, students are connecting to their local community, understanding the impacts of climate on their local community. And the Understand portion of the lesson, students begin to investigate the underlying science and social science of that particular topic. In this case, they're investigating the underlying science of climate processes and the interaction with human systems and outputs. And they do that by using data and models, including using data depicted in art. And then finally, in the last section of each lesson is ACT. And this is where students are using different tools, including art, to communicate their student-determined actions as they work to address the problem locally. And I loved the examples that each of you put in there, whether they're stop motion videos showing the water cycle that the students have created. And I have a 7-year-old granddaughter, and she creates videos so quickly, and I cannot believe what students could do today to communicate their knowledge, or whether they're using paper mache to communicate their understanding of a local problem. All right, next slide. So one of the articles that came out of the Smithsonian Magazine addressed a topic, some science that came out of our National Museum of Natural History. And again, Jen Collins is on the call with us. And this particular paper, which was about how Earth's global temperatures have drastically changed over the past 485 million years, driven by carbon dioxide, is a complex paper. It's part of an ongoing research effort that began in 2018 when several scientists from the Smithsonian were helping to develop the museum's fossil hall, or Deep Time exhibit, the David H. Koch Hall of Fossils, called Deep Time. And that hall aimed to put the museum's fossils in context by highlighting how Earth's climate has changed over the past 500 million years. And those specimens, including these fossilized palm fronds, which you see here, which were found in Alaska, they basically are used by the researchers to basically to attest to the fact that the Earth's past, the global temperatures have shifted, and we're actually much warmer than they are today. On the next slide, you'll see a graph that's part of that paper that basically demonstrates some of the information the scientists have collected over time. So I just want you to, this is a typical thing that a science teacher might do. They might give students scientific data and ask the students to examine that data and answer two simple questions. And I want you to do that too in the chat. So my first question to you is, what do you notice about this graph? Keeping in mind, this is 485 million years worth of data. And on the x-axis is the number of millions of years ago, and on the y-axis is the global temperature in Celsius. So what do you notice, just at a very simple level in the chat, what do you notice about the graph, the data on the graph? All right, so Lindsay says lots of peaks and valleys, right? That it's not just a linear growth of temperature, but there's lots of peaks and valleys. Shaheen says there's absolutely rise and fall of data, lots of variability, and that variability seems to be repeating over time. All right, so temperatures have absolutely fluctuated over time. And the idea here is that how do you take complex scientific data that's typically depicted in complex scientific graphs and help students understand the underlying ideas of that data through art? So on the next slide, I'm going to show you an activity that actually comes from our climate action guide. So again, the Smithsonian Science Education Center, so fortunate, we learn about all the amazing science that's happening across the Smithsonian and try to find ways to bring that science to students into classrooms through curricular resources and professional development for teachers. So inside the climate action guide, we actually show this piece of art. So I want you to look at this artwork. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, and then I'm going to ask you to try to answer a question. And this question is actually in the climate action guide. All right, so this is called painting number 1. And this is by Jill Pelto. It's watercolor and colored pencil from 2021. And she called the painting Tree Line Migration. So in looking at this first painting, painting number 1, I'm going to call it, this painting is the 5th and final painting that Jill Pelto did in a series depicting how Norway spruce and other trees may shift habitat zones as the climate changes rapidly. So the lower portion of the artwork shows a dense forest of spruce. And they stop growing on the mountainside at the tree line, that is at the edge of the habitat. Above the line, there are fewer trees. So here's the question that our developer in this climate action guide asks the students to think about. What do you think inspired the artwork by Jill Pelto? So what do you think inspired the artwork by Jill Pelto? Go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat. Yeah, so Deborah said a graph. And yes, I mean, if you look closely at the picture, you see several things. And Julie and Deborah said they definitely are seeing data points. There's definitely a graph in here. It's hidden inside of the image. And the graph, according to Walker, and the temperature are represented here in this graph and then through the artwork itself. And so Jenna says the migration might have inspired the artwork. We can see how the graph shapes the treetops inside of the piece, and the mountain follows that same line. So it's interesting how what she basically did was she chose to add this yellow line, which is an actual piece of data, a graph, to the artwork. And that graph is a graph of global atmospheric temperature data from 1880 to 2020. So in the past, the tree line was higher under a different climate, which is living proof of the resilience of species like this Norway spruce. I'm going to show you another one very quickly because I want to make certain that I can turn it back over to my colleagues. But this is painting too, and this is also by Jill Pelto, and it's inside of our Climate Action Guide. And this is a watercolor and colored pencil, and she did this one in 2015. And the painting is called Increasing Forest Fire Activity. The painting also uses global temperature rise data from 1880 to 2015. And in this really cool article, Jill wrote the following. She said, "Fortunately, I was not near any of the massive forest fires that raged before, during, or after my 2 weeks in Washington in the summer of 2015. But I was greeted with many smoke-filled days, and on some days when the winds blew from the fire toward us, the smell and taste of the smoke overpowered my senses, even though the fire was about 100 miles away. As temperatures increase and drought and drier than average conditions persist, forest fires become a huge threat to the forest, plants, animals, and of course to the people in the structure." And just, you don't have to put this in the chat, but you can see there's another, Jenna wrote it, like another graph that shapes the top of the treetops, only this time we see the fire in the background. So on the next slide, this is the actual graph of data that these two pictures came from. You know, one is a 12-month running mean and the other is a 132-month running mean. And you can see the differences. Of course, the one with 132-month is a much smoother graph, and the one with the 12-month running mean is much more variable. But the trends are very similar, where you're seeing increased temperatures over time. So I just want to end with two more slides, which is that as I turn it over to my colleague, this artwork is actually at Jennifer Collins' the National Museum of Natural History, where Jen Collins works. And this exhibit is called Art by Climate, or Art and Climate. It's an exhibit at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. You can actually see that artwork that I just shared with you in that exhibit. It opened up on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2025, in the Ocean Hall of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History here in Washington, D.C. But it's also part of something that I was involved in, which is from the 5th National Climate Assessment, the NCA5, which brought together science and art to highlight the relationship between humans and the atmosphere and to build climate awareness. So if you are at all interested in seeing amazing pieces of art done by students and adults, please look for the the 5th National Climate Assessment 5 online, NCA5, and you'll see this artwork and many others that are found in our National Museum of Natural History, also in our climate exhibit guide. On the last slide, if you're interested in any more ways to bring science and art, history, and culture together in a transdisciplinary way, please check out our other free Smithsonian Science for Global Goals STEAM education resources for the youth, which cover a variety of topics like the ones that I showed you on the very first graph that are sustainability topics for ages 11 to 18. All right, so with that, Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm hoping you'll be able to share some of the amazing other resources that the participants can have access to.
Yes, and I put in, thanks Carol and Allison, and I put a link to the 5th National Climate Assessment in the chat, but did not have time to put the direct link to the standard, the literacy guide. But we are excited to share that we just launched a STEAM learning page on the Smithsonian website. And this is brand new, so we will continually to collect different resources from across the Smithsonian, the various different units and museums to feature STEM resources. So we have a couple different categories, so STEAM with family and friends, STEAM in school, digital resources in STEAM, and then some links to where you can find STEAM at the Smithsonian when you visit. And so that will be in the Learning Lab as well. And we look forward to building this repository. And I will turn it back to Lupa.
Great, thank you so much. So I think we can open up to Q&A. And yeah, so please, I saw one person had their hand raised, so please just put your questions. You can either use the Q&A function or the chat, and we'll try to respond to people. I'll also put the link again to the Learning Lab collection. So we have everything that was discussed today. You can find that in the collection. So any thoughts, comments, questions? Thank you so much to all of our panelists. It was really an exciting session today. So one person is asking for the lessons in pamphlets. Can we order them from the museum?
Well, I think that at least for the Smithsonian Science Education Center, and I would imagine the other resources, they're digital resources. For us, the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals project that I shared, they're all PDFs, so they can be printed, but they also have accompanying story maps. So it goes back to the comment Alison and others have made that have digital resources as well. So you can print the resources, but they're all online.
Yeah, ours is in we have a Learning Lab collection that has the activity and the story map and all the pieces that go with that together.
So here's another one. Are there any opportunities for high school students to be a teaching assistant in those programs?
So we run a variety of high school internship programs, so they're not teaching assistantships, but we, like I said, the pour painting activity was developed by high school students. Like, they were amazing. So we have high school internships and students who do a range of things with us, but at least currently those are all primarily in person. So we're working with students around DC, Maryland, Baltimore.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I'll find the link. The Smithsonian has an internship page, and they will post all sorts of different internships for high school students and others. And so people can look through there to see if there's good alignment.
Here, I just found that.
Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, I'll put in the chat link to the Smithsonian Science Education Center's internships. And we also have a youth ambassador program that I mentioned earlier, where we select, Catherine, I don't know if you're still on the line, but I think we select about 20 to 25 youth ambassadors each year. And they come from all over the world. So they don't physically come to the Smithsonian Science Education Center. We work with them virtually for a year.
So here's a question that came into the Q&A section. How would a homeroom teacher in elementary school and the arts teacher work together toward a STEAM project like these? I'll put that in the chat. Any thoughts on that?
You know, I will put a link. I'll let Carol answer this question, Carol Wilson, but I'm going to put a link to an article we wrote together about how do you go from teaching a single discipline. I was an elementary school teacher, single discipline, to teaching multiple disciplines together with other teachers. And hopefully that it's about transdisciplinary teaching and learning. So maybe that might be helpful. Carol?
Sure. Yeah, great question. Sometimes starting with a field trip is great, to go to the art museum and just see art that inspires students and sees what might, sort of catch their interest. Also looking with the art teacher, seeing what their curriculum is, if they're working on, ceramics, or they're working on collage, whatever that might be. You can also sometimes bringing in a third teacher, maybe a history teacher or social studies teacher, can also kind of be interesting, especially when you're looking at, creating an artwork that either expresses a historical moment or a moment in time. Those could be some really good ways to kind of, brainstorm together. We also have summer teacher institutes here at Smithsonian, a lot of opportunities for teachers to come during the summer to learn with us. Normally at SAM, we have 2-week-long institutes where we help you integrate art into your curriculum. We have a National Education Summit as well, run out of our office of the Undersecretary for Education. And those offer both, virtual and in-person opportunities to, come and be inspired by Smithsonian or by all, art and culture and science and history and how that might manifest in your classroom. Let's see, sometimes old school, just having like posters of art objects in your classroom can really spark ideas and have students respond to that, either by working on, creating a poem or a creative writing project. It doesn't have to always be a studio art project, or you could also meld those two together. And I would just offer on our website as well, we have a ton of resources, which I can post in the chat, different teacher guides and opportunities. We also do distance learning. So if you wanted to hook up with us virtually through our Artful Connections program, we can potentially, share some other artworks similar to the ones I shared today to inspire students and might inspire some classroom projects as well.
Any other questions, comments? Have I missed any? Does anyone else see any that I've missed? No. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank our presenters so much for today's session. We really went around trying to figure out how to do it, and I think it came out just so well. So thank you so much for being here. And everything is in the collection. Please reach out to us at learninglab.si or learninglab@si.edu if you need to reach us. And I also just put a link in the chat for the next Cultivating Learning session, which will be on June 16th. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Philippa.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.